Thank you to our co-hosts. And one of the things that is exciting for me about stepping out from behind the screen and seeing you all in real life is recognizing that people and innovators are at the center of building this market. So at Microsoft, my role is to manage our Climate Innovation Fund, our investment activities outside the bounds of Microsoft. But Microsoft is not only an investor in the carbon removal space, we're also a buyer. And we have purchased from some of the CDR companies here, including Climeworks and Heirloom in particular. And so from that perspective, as both a customer and an investor, we're really focused on three things at this moment in time for this market. The first is quality, the second is cost, and the third is market development, all the other ingredients that will help this market grow from the nascent and emerging space it's in today to where the science and the economists tell us we need to be in order to reach our net zero future. So first, quality. Microsoft is exclusively focused on negative emissions, both nature-based and engineered. And we've partnered with many of you here today on this. It's incredibly important at this moment in time for the credibility of the overall carbon markets that we really demonstrate quality through partnership with third-party standard bodies, through partnership with diligence advisors, and through a shared recognition that what we're trying to do is reverse climate change. The second focus area, cost, is also important to this moment in time. We're at an inflection point, and the thing that will help this market take off is if we can begin to demonstrate progress along the cost curves that we, both on the buying side and the supplying side, have promised. And so that's why I'm really excited to see the scale-up efforts underway. I'm a big believer in deployment-led innovation as a driver of cost down. The third and final theme that we're really focused on at Microsoft for CDR today is market development. I see a few major ingredients, all of which are represented here today, in terms of building and scaling that market. The first is the technology. The second is early demand, early capital, and finally, industry standards. And I would say collaboration to inform those industry standards. I'm incredibly heartened to see the DOE DAC hubs take off. I think that provides some of the fuel that this industry needs to really jumpstart that scale-up process. And what we all need to do is jump behind that flywheel and really drive it forward.
Good morning. And first, let me just say a huge thank you to the Climeworks team for hosting this wonderful brunch. I'm sure many of you who have been in this space would never have imagined a few years ago that there'd be this many people in one place over the week to talk about durable removals. So yeah, thanks to them. So, quick introduction. My name is Karan Mistry. I'm a managing director and partner with the Boston Consulting Group based in California. I spend all of my time in our climate and sustainability practice and in clean energy, mostly split between doing renewable energy procurements and supporting the acceleration of emerging climate technologies. And most relevant to today, I've been in the durable removal space for about the last 5 years, and thrilled to be talking with you all about this topic. Today, I want to start with just, wow, what an exciting time for the industry. I'm sure you've all been following the news, but just off the top of my head in the last few months, there's the DAC Hub announcements, and huge congrats to both Climeworks and Heirloom for that funding. There's the Microsoft announcement, Amazon's done purchases, BCG's done purchases, and the list goes on. And based on our research, we expect this trend to continue. It really is an exciting time. I want to talk to you guys about a recent report that we put out last week about the size of the durable removals market. And let me start with just what do I mean by durable. It's difficult to come up with nomenclature in this industry. So we loosely use the word durable to describe anything that's 100 years or more of permanence and of high quality negative emissions. So yeah, why do we even care about this? First, when we talk about removals, it's very common to hear some really, really large numbers. We hear numbers like 5 to 15 gigatons per year of removals are needed in order to hit our net zero goals. And sure, the math here is sound, these numbers are valid, but when we actually look at where people are making money decisions, where business decisions are being made, people don't tend to care about those numbers as much because it's based on what's needed versus what actual behavior is indicating. And so when talking with a bunch of our friends in the space, we came to the conclusion that we really need to think about what are people actually doing? What's current policy? What is the market shaping up to be? And let's try to size what the market will be based on those rather than aspirational numbers. So that's the context. The objectives of the paper were threefold. First, show the viability of the market in the near and medium term. Second, understand what's driving buyers' behaviors and how they think about portfolio of products. And third, any identification of the types of activities and initiatives that could be taken by various stakeholders to accelerate the market. So with that, let me cover some of the findings that we had. The first one, the size of the market is quite impressive. So by 2030, we are estimating about 40 to 200 megatons of removals from durable CDR. This number far outstrips the announced supply, which is on the order of 15 to 30 megatons. So even though this is driven by voluntary market, and even though we're taking the assumption of what are people doing today, we're seeing a market that is looking very promising. Even though these numbers are impressive, if we look at announced net zero pledges and assume companies are going to be honest with their pledges, and we assume that they'll do up to 10% removals as allowed by SBTI, those numbers balloon. We're looking at 1 to 1.5 gigatons per year. So a very exciting time. When we think about buyer behavior, it's probably no surprise to anyone in here, a portfolio approach is needed. Customers are looking to balance quality, quantity, cost, and risk. And they're willing to pay a premium for those higher quality, higher durability offsets. We saw about 3.5x premium. It was about, on average, what folks were willing to pay for. And I'll add, we have pretty high confidence in the profile that we got, given we got the opportunity to talk to over 100 current and prospective buyers of CDR. Basically means we talk to everybody who's trying to buy CDR. And then finally, before I start to hand it over to our fireside chat, there is so much opportunity for stakeholders to drive action here. From the policy side, making sure that negative removals, high quality removals are allowable under things like ETSs and other schemes. From investors, if you have a market that you're staring down where it is going to be supply limited, that makes for some very promising business decisions. From the companies who are trying to buy, if you actually want offtake in 2030, we need to act now. So kudos to the companies who are actively signing offtake agreements now. Why don't we start with some of the local news? So we all know about the DAC Hub announcements. The funding is transformative for the industry. It would be great to hear from you guys of how you see this affecting the industry as a whole, and particularly if you could talk about how it impacts the offtakers.
Yeah, thanks, Karan. Great question. I would think about it in three ways. So first of all, big thanks to the US government and the Department of Energy. It really is a tremendous support in terms of CapEx, in terms of the actual financing of our scale-up plans. The second thing I would call out is it is a signal to the market, right? The Department of Energy is basically the most rigorous and the most in-depth body in the world that is looking at carbon removal. And so them saying Climeworks, in our case, gets awarded 3 projects, that is a big help for us and cements our leadership position in the global carbon removal space. And third, I would say it is a big sign for the entire industry because it shows how carbon removal is here and now the market will be taking off.
Great. We're obviously very excited about this development with the DAC hubs to partner with Climeworks and some others embarking on this journey. As Karan mentioned, with some of his findings from the research, there's still a pretty big gap between durable CDR supply and demand. and an even bigger gap with the IPCC's guidance in terms of the role of carbon removals to limit climate change. As an industry, I think that we've really got to focus on shifting from planning to rapid deployment and scale at this point. The funds that are available from the DAC Hub show the Biden administration's commitment to DAC technology to limit climate change. The words from the DAC Hub actually combine public and private funds so that we can build and quickly scale up DAC technology, decrease costs, increase demand, and ultimately get to gigaton scale, which is where we need to get to. This is the biggest and the most important deployment of DAC around the world. And so as a recipient of these funds, we have a deep responsibility, feel a deep responsibility to build trust with communities at the center of that, including creating good paying jobs. But that said, we're all here for a reason. We don't have time to waste. We really have to start digging into, the execution of this. The most recent UN stocktake report shows that we're pretty close to missing the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? So it's time to roll up our sleeves and get moving, and I think this DAC Hub helps signify that.
Thanks both. One of the most exciting things I saw in the study was the willingness to pay numbers. I don't know about some of the folks here. Frankly, I was a little bit of a skeptic of some of the large numbers we saw, but talking to everybody, they ended up coming in much higher than we expected, which is great news for the industry. Specifically, we saw that many customers are willing to pay up to 3.5 times the cost of less durable CDR credits. Would be interesting to hear the types of conversations you guys are having and what sort of mechanisms you have to account for cost and make it more feasible for folks to purchase at costs they can afford in the short term, given the expected cost decline over time. I'll start with you, Nishad, given the recent Microsoft announcement.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms, I think that there's kind of three things that we have to focus on in terms of bringing costs down. The first thing is we need long-term advanced purchase agreements. That's going to allow us to unlock lower cost of capital and bring the cost down overall. I think the second thing is we've got to open up storage pathways, and that's specifically with respect to the development and availability of Class 6 wells. That's another thing that'll help us bring costs down. And then finally, I think we've really got to focus on opening up procurement and compliance markets, and really sending a strong signal to the marketplace to usher in things like project finance, which is another lever and mechanism that can help us bring costs down.
I would agree to all the points that you're mentioning, Nishad. I would put it that way. The cost challenge is not going to be solved in the lab. We're big believers in that. Climeworks has shown the way for 3 years already with actually deploying capacity and having it in the field, learning in the field. And so by scaling up and continuing to deploy around the world in different climate conditions, direct air capture, CDR capacity, that is the number one way to actually bring down the cost and eventually meet the willingness to pay in the market. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about the demand side in a minute.
Great. I want to continue on the quality topic. So to unlock the price premium for the higher end credits, of course, durability and the quality of storage is one thing. The other piece that really comes up is MRV. Basically, everyone who's buying wants to have confidence that they're actually getting what they're paying for. Adrian, I'd be curious to hear about how you guys are thinking about MRV, especially in light of the recent Pure Earth announcement.
Yeah, great question. We're excited to see that the market is starting to really realize the most important thing is trust. And trust means if you as a buyer, as an off-taker, you're purchasing 1 ton of carbon removal, you want to be 100% sure that you actually get 1 ton of carbon removal delivered. And so that is where the whole MRV topic plays the crucial role to ensuring that. With direct air capture, it is relatively straightforward. You want to make sure all gray emissions are accounted for. You want to make sure you have a clear baseline. You want to make sure you use only renewable energy to power your facilities. And then you measure that, again, relatively straightforward with direct air capture. And in combination with the permanence and the durability, you as a buyer will eventually be able to account what you purchase in terms of carbon removal towards your science-based targets at net zero. And that, in a nutshell, is what we're seeing. The market is waking up to that, and also hence our collaboration with our friends at Puro.
Yeah, agree with everything Adrian said. I think that from our perspective, I spend the most of my waking hours talking to buyers, and I think Brandon hit on a number of these things in terms of what buyers are looking for, when they're looking at durable CDR. I think quality is always number one. Cost is not far behind. And then there's a third one, which we'll touch on later on, which is really community engagement and benefits. But with respect to the quality aspect of it, there's in the wake of some of the credit controversies that we've all been seeing in the news, hearing about, reading about, there's kind of a greater attention to whether CDR companies can deliver what they say they're going to deliver. And the way that we approach this is to really work with independent third-party bodies that are going to be able to ensure that we deliver what we say we're going to deliver. I think that the ability to create independence in this process, give customers and off-takers confidence that they're getting what they pay for is incredibly important. Probably one of the most important things that we can do in our process. Adrian, you mentioned trust, right? That's really what it comes down to. We're all in a very nascent industry. We're developing our sciences, our technologies, and things like that. And trust is the most important thing that we can establish right up front.
So I have one more question for the two of them. If there are audience questions, I think we only have one mic, but if you want to come on this side of the table after this question, we'll start handing it off. So from the research, we found that over the next 7-ish years, really we expect demand driven by the voluntary market. But aspirationally, and frankly, what we all believe is at some point in time, the compliance market is going to take off. Of course, we need it to, but just based on reading the tea leaves, we expect it to in some way. I'd be curious to hear from both of you, which types of policies get you most excited, and which do you think have the most chance of success in the near future?
Sure, absolutely. So, going back to what we were talking about before with respect to, this gap between durable CDR supply and demand, and then the bigger gap with the IPCC's guidance. We clearly need, policy to, help close that gap. Policy is a bridge to closing that gap. And there's a number of different things that are going on right now that I'm sure that we're all aware about around the world, right? The U.S. is leading, I think, with a number of policies. The DAC Hub funding happens to be one of them. We've got 45Q from the Inflation Reduction Act. But, this can't just happen in the U.S. This has to happen globally. And it's heartening to see that, some of these grassroots efforts within government and policy and procurement and compliance are starting to really get some legs. There's some developments in Canada about supply side subsidies for these types of initiatives. In UK and EU, there's discussions about building carbon removals into the ETS system. In California, my home state, there's measures that are focused on transparency for carbon footprint, as well as requiring emitters to actually remove their carbon emissions. I think that it's absolutely necessary for us to really put those measures into place in order to really get to the climate goals that we need to.
Agreed to all those points. Policy is going to be a big driver to address the supply constraint or that demand supply gap that BCG has found in their study. I would add a second layer to that beyond policy, and that is accelerated offtake for carbon removal today. I found it very interesting. I briefly looked up this morning. There is, as of today, 5,998 companies in the world that do have a SBTi net zero target. Of these 5,900 companies, 32 have bought carbon removal so far. And so that is 0.5%, right? And if we can get the next 100 and then the next 100 Microsofts really being serious about purchasing durable removal at scale today, that will be the biggest lever in order to unlock that supply, because it gives the industry the confidence to actually execute projects and bring them in the field and also to finance them, quite frankly. And if we do that, it solves our second problem, which is the cost, because as we discussed earlier, cost challenge is going to be solved in the field and not in the lab.